Hey there, Peg. Great to have you back here on the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. We are so excited to bring you back, not only just because we like chatting with you, but because you also have some new ideas and resources to share with the Making Math Moments That Matter community. So before we dig into that, Peg, it's been a while since you've been on the show. How are you? Where are you coming to us from? And how's things going?
Um, I am coming to you from Pittsburgh, which is where I live, and I have been mostly retired for the last few years, although I did find time to write a new book. But other than that, I've been doing a lot of traveling, trying to visit some of the national parks in the United States and just lots of fun museums and those kinds of things.
Awesome stuff. Awesome stuff. And what would you say when you say mostly retired? I'm super curious. What does that mean to Peg?
Well, Well, let's just say over the last few years, I've done some work with some school districts, but that's basically been winding down. So right now, actually finishing this book was sort of my last real math adventure. Um, and I've been more reluctant to like go to conferences and things like that because it, um, it feels like it's time for the next generation to step up to the plate, and it seems like they have been. So I'm comfortable leaving all those things in the hands of the people who are going to follow in our footsteps.
Well, that we are thrilled for you that you're recognizing that and taking this time for yourself to enjoy retirement, but certainly your voice would be one that is missed by the community at conferences. And I know that your work continues to inspire a lot of educators. So I know you've been on the show before, and we're wondering, although you've shared a math moment in the past, what maybe is a math moment that's been resonating with you lately?
Um, well, it'll make more sense once I talk a little bit about the book. But one of the things that came out of the last set of books we wrote were the 19 challenges that we've identified that teachers have experienced when trying to enact the five practices. So what we did in that series was try to provide examples of what the practices look like using video, and then talk about the challenges teachers face and how you might actually overcome them. So one of the things that occurred to me was I wondered how familiar these challenges that we identified would be to people at large, whether they knew the five practices or not. So I recently being about a year ago, did a did some work with some teachers that I'd been working with for a couple of years, and I decided to give them a list that had the 19 challenges on them just to see what they would come up with. They knew just a tiny bit about the five practices. And what I started realizing, and it had been confirmed by some other things that have happened after that, that even if teachers didn't know about the five practices, they recognized and really resonated with the challenges, whether they knew the five practices or not. While I grouped the challenges into the five practices, they didn't even need those as a guide. The idea of trying to understand student thinking or finding a high level task, those were just things that resonated with them. So I realized then that if I took these things that they identified as challenges, which were all things that I wanted them to be working on, I could actually plan the professional development for them around the things that they had personally identified as being the things that they were grappling with. And out of a group of, I think there were 20 teachers, almost 2/3 of them identified some of the exact same things.
Mm.
So I
That's
thought that was really empowering to me because I thought, well, if I'd been doing this for years, I would have been tailoring professional development a little bit more targetedly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I can imagine because I mean, even in some of the questions that we had, in our minds for you today, we talk about how the five practices gives us like a great structure to follow, right? It gives you a framework, something to be thinking about, and it almost naturally is addressing some of those challenges. And I'm sure that the nuances are parts that are still struggles and challenges people, sort of endure. So would you say, because a question I was wondering about is like back when you wrote the initial book, and that book has really changed, the way I teach mathematics, the way Yvette's taught mathematics. Yvette and I have done PD for many, many years together. And I know it's impacted John and all the work we do at Making Math Moments here. And I guess my wonder is, what would you say is the biggest, like, is it these challenges that are the biggest epiphany that you've had since? Or is there maybe one of them that you feel like sticks its head out more than the others? Like, what would you say is something now that maybe you wish you knew back when you wrote that original book?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's like, well, if I knew then what I knew now, that first book probably would have been different, but how would it have been different? I think one of the things that we always knew was important was the setting of clear goals. But I think that over the last few years, even in doing the 5 practices in practice books, it became very clear how hard it was to really come up with a learning goal, even for teachers who, some of the teachers that we featured in those books, that was not an easy thing to do. And what I've noticed since then is that the teachers that I've worked with, both teachers that I worked with when I was teaching at the university and as well as practicing teachers, very few people identify setting a learning goal as a challenge. In fact, almost nobody does, but almost to a person, it's the most challenging thing they face. So one of the things that I've been trying to think about in writing this book was thinking about, okay, they're not going to identify a goal, but how can we get them to focus on that anyway? Because if you don't know where you're going, you're going to end up someplace else. And that was Yogi Berra, by the way. And I said that once at a PD session a couple of years ago, and I said, that was Yogi Berra. And I said, does anyone, and it was a bunch of young people, I said, does anyone know who Yogi Berra is? And the guy raises his hand, he goes, I know who Yogi Berra is. And I said, yeah, but that's something very different. But anyway, this whole idea that you've got to be clear on what the outcome is so that you always can hold those goals in mind as you're asking questions and as you're calling up students to present their work and those kinds of things. So I think how fundamental that is to the whole process has really become crystal clear.
Feel like you are speaking directly to my soul right now, Peg, because if you were to ask me which step is the most important step of the practices, it's step 0. I've always said that, teacher clarity to me is what empowers you as a strong facilitator to move students towards the target, as well as transparency with students. Like, I firmly believe that students should also be empowered to know where we're going so that they can self-assess along the journey. So Kyle and I are wondering, what do teachers need to feel confident in identifying a learning goal? And I think there's so much conversation and maybe even inconsistency around what a learning goal is.
Well, so for me, a learning goal is what you want students to understand as a result of engaging in a lesson, not what you want them to do. I mean, you've got to be clear on what you want them to do, but Jim Hebert and his colleagues used to talk about what's the residue that gets left behind as a result of having done something. That's the mathematical understanding that you take with you as you go to the next thing you're going to do. And a lot of it, I think, comes from, I mean, you have to understand mathematics. And I think that even people who know mathematics, it's like I keep trying to get them to dig deeper. So for example, even secondary teachers that I worked with, I'll say, so what do you want them to learn as a result of this lesson? I want them to be able to find the intersection of two linear equations. I want them to find that point. I said, okay, so what do you want them to understand about the point of intersection? And then keep pressing. And actually, there's an example in the new book about this exact conversation. Just kept pressing the teacher. It's like, well, I want them to understand that point would satisfy both equations. Okay, what do you mean satisfy? Those X and Y values will make the equation true. Okay, what else would you want them to know? What happens around that point? Well, I'd want them to know that, you know, I mean, if, you know, in most circumstances, if they're not parallel or they're not the same line, they're going to intersect somewhere, and one's going to be higher before the point of intersection, and the other one's going to be lower after it. So they basically change position if they don't have the same slope. And so really trying to tease out. But what I found is if you keep asking those questions, they start asking themselves those questions when they go to write a goal.
Right.
So it's like, okay, that's what I want them to do. What is it I want them to understand about slope? What is it I want them to understand about fraction multiplication? So trying to pull that apart, because I think if you have an idea of what the underlying understanding is, then you ask different questions and you aren't satisfied just with a correct answer.
I love it. I love it. This is so important. I love the way you're articulating here, because I think that's where, as educators, we get so stuck in the like what the kids are going to do without really thinking about what that will result in. You know, I always like to say, like, what will they know, understand, and be able to do? Not just what they're going to do in the learning process, but like, what could they do with this information after? Yeah. And when you ask these questions, it really allows you to start thinking about, like, what's the point? You know, like, really, like, simply, why am I doing this? Like, why is that an important thing for students to know and understand? So your example, I think, really helps to highlight that. And I feel like I have some ideas here as to why this, you know, the answer to this next question, but I'm really curious of your perspective on it, which is, along the way, the 5 practices, as we've mentioned, is a great structure, but I don't think, and unless you've seen differently, I don't think we're consistently doing it in mathematics classrooms, right? We're not consistently doing it. So what would you say is maybe one of the biggest challenges as to why, you know, it's not being adopted by all? I think all people who know mathematics and they know, you know, effective instruction, they know the work, they see value in the work, and they obviously are promoting, you know, this approach. What do you think is that holdup? Do you think it is this idea that teachers are getting bogged down by the learning goal, or are they getting bogged down by something else? Like, where do you think that bottleneck is happening when it comes to trying to do this more consistently with the, you know, the different lessons that we're teaching in a math curriculum?
I think I think the biggest challenge is planning and the amount of time it actually takes to plan a lesson where you're going to do the 5 practices, because you have to figure out the goal and task. Okay, that's one thing. But then you have to, I think the hard work is trying to anticipate what students are going to do and figuring out the questions that you're going to ask for particular solutions that are going to highlight students' thinking and move them towards the goal of the lesson. And so when I've worked with teachers in professional development, we often do what we call a learning lab. So one teacher will be teaching and a group of us will go and watch. And that teacher and I will work with that teacher in trying to plan the lesson. And most teachers will say that when you plan the lesson that carefully, it goes much better than when you don't. But trying to find the time to do that level of planning on a consistent basis turns out to be more than, and I can understand that actually. If you're teaching multiple preps a day, and you're trying to plan at that level of detail. So my advice has always been that okay, so let's just take it off the table. Don't try to do it every day. But try to do it once a week or once every 2 weeks, and plan with somebody else so you don't have the burden of the planning on your shoulders, and that 1 week you take the lead, then your partner takes the lead. And if you do that consistently, periodically, consistently, over the course of a year, you'll have a bank of lessons, and of course, saving everything that you collected and created, so that you can go back and reflect on what happened. And then when you pick up that lesson the next year, say, okay, what went well, what didn't, what are we going to change? So I think that a lot of times if I've noticed that teachers, like I tried it for a week and I just can't do it. And it's like, okay, well,
yeah,
maybe you
yeah,
were
they're burnt out,
or
they just went way too aggressively on it, right?
yes, I think that that's part of it.
I think you touched on so many relevant and key barriers that some people might face. And one thing that you shared was how important it is to engage in this work with somebody else. And that's really how I found it successful. I was so fortunate to have a teaching partner, and we were able to, like you mentioned, at first we would co-plan everything maybe twice a week, right? It wasn't every single day that we were delivering this detailed lesson, but twice a week maybe. But I had that other person to anticipate with, to talk through our moves. And even we would split our blocks so that we could actually do our monitoring and talk through our selecting and sequencing before we came back for the consolidation. So we were really clear on the intention of the consolidation. So that leads to the conversation about the powerful role of coaches in doing that co-planning, co-facilitating, and the learning that will come from that shared experience. So I know that this new book that you're currently working on or soon to be released does target that coach role and how coaches can be really significant in the implementation of this structure.
Yeah, so one of the things that we noticed, so you had the first book and that led us to the next three. And then it's like, okay, a lot of teachers now are working with a coach. And so maybe we need to think about what a coaching model would look like that really targeted the 5 practices. So the first thing that makes it a coaching model different is that, there is a clear focus. The goal of this coaching is to help you effectively implement the 5 practices in your classroom so that all students have access to high quality mathematics and the opportunity to develop identities as mathematicians. And that that's what everybody's aiming at. So unlike coaching that's more nebulous, you might say, this really has a specific outcome that we're looking for. And the other thing about it is going back to the challenges that I mentioned, those 19 challenges. We're using those 19 challenges as really a core piece of the coaching model, because we feel that those challenges really represent that things the teachers have to deal with in the classroom, whether they have prior experience with the 5 practices or not, and that all of those 19 things are really important things to attend to if your goal is ambitious instruction. So what we're suggesting in this model is the first thing you do after you've talked with the teachers and got them on board is you give them the 19 challenges, and you ask them to identify a couple, 3 to 5, that they've experienced, and just write a little bit about how that has played out in your classroom. And then those challenges become the focal point of conversations between the coach and the teacher. So now it's not a matter of saying to the teacher, what do you want to work on? Or the coach saying, I think you need to do this. It's a matter of, okay, what of these 19 things really speak to you? And these are the things we're going to work on. So now the teacher has an investment in what's going to be worked on because they've had a voice in that.
I love it.
And but the list has been constrained to things that we think are going to matter.
I love it. And you've got to assume, that out of those 19, that everyone's going to have at least a couple of those that come to mind, right? So it gives them a nice, variety of possibilities. And it also is something that's going to be productive. I think any coach or, mentor that's listening has had that experience where, a teacher identifies, we call it a pebble in their shoe, that is something that isn't really going to move the needle, but then you can't not work on it because the teacher perceives it to be important, right? And
Exactly.
here you've given them enough variety, you've given them enough, we'll call it option, in order to keep it, where the autonomy is there, where they can, really feel like they're working towards something that matters to them. And based on research, based on what about this work, that it will move the needle if we're able to try to hone in on those things. So when we turn to the book, now that we're talking about the book called Coaching the 5 Practices, what would anyone who's listening, who the vast majority of our listeners are in some sort of formal or informal leadership role, right? Usually those listening to math podcasts are in those, those types of roles. What would you say would be the biggest, benefit for a person in that role to be able to grab that book, dig in and go, wow, I'm able to now do X, Y, or Z a little bit better, a little bit more productively, a little more efficiently now that I've been exposed to this particular framework in the book?
Well, the first thing I want to tell you, just to make sure you and the audience all understand this, so that we actually, the book comes out of a research project where we worked with 8 coaches, and they each worked with 2 teachers in the school districts that they worked in. And this was a very diverse sample from different geographical regions and urban, suburban, rural districts as well. And so we've had a lot of things play out that we have data for, that we know that this is what happened when they did that. But one of the things the coaches we've worked with have said is having the challenges has been so enormously helpful to them, because it does bring a focus to the conversation. And they never had a teacher who couldn't identify at least 3 things, and some of them identified a whole lot more than that. So they felt like now they weren't imposing on the teacher what I thought you needed to work on, but rather could use what the teacher had generated. The other thing in the book that I think I would invite people to consider was, we also identified something that we call the inquiry routine. And this is meant to actually help the coach frame conversations with the teacher during a pre-lesson or a post-lesson conference. And there are really 4 components to the inquiry routine. And the first move is to invite. So the idea is that the teacher has given you some materials prior to teaching the lesson, and you as the coach are trying to put together key ideas you want to bring up in the conference. So the teacher or the coach may look at the materials and say, okay, so they identified, let's just use, for example, they identified the challenge of trying to listen to and make sense of student thinking, which is related to monitoring. And they noticed that when the teacher prepared their monitoring tool, they had anticipated all kinds of solutions, but they really had not come up with questions that were going to get students to articulate their thinking. So that the first thing that we would say the coach might want to do in that setting is to say, okay, I want you to explain what kind of questions you would ask the student who produced this solution, using a solution that they actually did produce, and just to see what the teacher's thinking about that. Now, the teacher may then come back with some really good questions that they would ask, in which case you're essentially done. But what it's not assuming is just because they didn't put anything down, they don't have any ideas on the subject. And if the teacher really struggles to actually come up with some questions they would ask, then you might move to our second move in the inquiry routine, which is rehearse. So the idea with rehearse is how to consider how a teaching action would play out in the classroom and consider possible responses. So for example, so maybe in the first conversation that about invite, the teacher said, well, I would ask them how they got the answer. Okay, so then the coach might say, well, why don't we do a little role play? I'm going to be the student and you're going to be the teacher. And you just asked me how I did it. So I'm going to explain to you mechanically, step by step, how I did it. What are you going to ask me now? So that now you've grounded it in an actual solution so that it now becomes more concrete. What would you want to do about this solution? And then I would come back with another student response, and we'd try to go back and forth to play that out a little bit, to see if the teacher can keep digging a little bit deeper.
I love that. And that's such a, like this process, I'm envisioning it in my mind and I'm picturing actually, I don't know, Yvette, we were in a grade 7 classroom one time and we were talking about division. And I remember that there was a few moments in time. This was at a school in the Tecumseh area, we'll say. And we ran out, it was like we hit that wall ourselves where we were working with students. And you eventually get to that place. Like when you ask the next question and the student responds, and then you ask another question, the student responds, and then you get to a place where you go, I'm not sure what else to ask here, but you might not have all the information that you really wanted, right? Like you're still not exactly sure what the student has done or why they did it that way.
Exactly.
And you can only imagine that by doing this work, be it through role play or be it in the classroom with students, where it's going to just create more flexibility for you in the moment to be able to do this more often, even in the days that we aren't doing, say, a formal, 5 practices planned lesson as you've articulated. So what are you noticing, or actually maybe do you want to take us through the last 2 of the inquiry routine? That would be amazing. I just wanted to let you know, like, I'm envisioning what you're saying here. And I think it's so important and helpful that we do this practice so that we can, better prepare ourselves for not just that lesson, but other lessons that might come up in the future as well.
So the next move in the routine is suggest. And so if you think about this is somewhat sequential in the way I've been describing it. You invite the teacher and they have a hard time responding. So you try to take them through a rehearsal. And then if that still doesn't seem to be getting you anywhere, then you might actually make some suggestions. So for example, you might say, well, suppose the student did this. Could you ask, what does this represent? What does that represent? What does this mean? Does the answer make sense? I mean, and you would tie it to a particular solution so that you could say, so what does that mean when you get a remainder in the division? I mean, what does that tell you? So really just trying to, and depending upon what the actual challenge is, there may be even more specific suggestions. So if your challenge had to do with keeping track of what groups are doing, and they haven't been able to come up with a method of doing this, you might say, well, suppose you had on your monitoring chart and you sort of jotted down names, or that you put table numbers on each group's table so that you could say group 1 was doing this, or group 2 was doing this. Or if you asked a question, you could leave the question on a post note at the table. So when you came back, you'd remember what you asked. And then rather than just throwing out the suggestions, for each suggestion, say, how do you think that would help? So that it's not simply telling like I'm telling you what to do, but I'm inviting you really to consider some options that you might want to implement and what benefit they might have for you.
I love it. I love it. So you've got invite. So you're inviting them. You're working together here. You're rehearsing to play it out. If you sort of, it sounds like essentially this process is almost like an if-then sort of scenario, right? It's like when you hit the, what do we do now? You move to the next part of the phase. So we go to rehearse. We're going to maybe role play a little bit here and try to play out that scenario. Maybe they're still struggling. You've given, the part I like about this is you've essentially used mentorship like moves to this point where you're asking the questions of the educator, much like we want to be asking the students in a math classroom, right? Before we get to suggesting, trying a strategy. And you're doing this for the educator, then and only then does it make sense to sort of maybe come up with a suggestion, not saying that it's the way or the only way you could go, but hey, what about this? That might maybe trigger the educator to come up with another perspective, right? Or maybe they go, oh, now that you've said that, Peg, maybe what about this? And you could, oh, that's great. Awesome. Here we go. And then after that, did you include the fourth, or is there another
There's one more.
One more. I'm super curious here, and I'm loving the flow here. It seems to me very helpful given the fact that we do a lot of this type of coaching just for me to stay on track as we do this work, because I think humans naturally, especially educators, we naturally want to jump to the answer, right? To like give answers instead of allowing people to arrive at an answer so that they can do the learning themselves. So I'm loving it. I'm excited here for the fourth.
So the fourth one is actually generalize. And so what we want the coach to ultimately be able to do is if you worked through all this with the teacher and they've come up with some ideas that they want to try out, then you want to sort of pop out. So it's something that transcends this particular lesson. So it's the idea that, so what will you do when planning future lessons in order to be prepared to, really dig into student thinking? And why will that be helpful to you? So you don't want them to think this is just a one and done. We've done it for this lesson, but sort of lift up the idea here so that the next time you're planning a lesson, you're thinking about, oh, wait, what questions can I ask to make sure I'm getting students thinking on the table?
What you just said, Peg, reminded me of our conversation earlier about what we want students to walk away with.
Right.
Right? It's not just what they can do in this isolated task, but what understanding can they carry forward to future tasks? And I totally see a correlation. I know that Kyle's thinking the same thing that I am, that this is the structure that I need as a coach to ensure that my interactions with teachers are meaningful. Because you alluded to this at the beginning of the call, sometimes to go in and think we're going to tackle math is so broad and it's so general, and we're not really clear on what it is we're even hoping to achieve through that coaching session. But in the same way that 5 practices allowed me as a teacher to be intentional, organized, precise, I see the same application to this particular model with those coaching conversations. And I think it's almost like you could have every single interaction with every teacher you encounter follow these phases, and it would result in something different and meaningful every time.
In fact, what one of the coaches that we have worked with have said that once you have these 3 things, you find that even when you're having a casual conversation, you're taking a step back and you're first inviting before you make any assumptions about anything. And that has really changed the way they think about it. The other thing I want to add is we also encourage coaches to use these flexibly. Like you don't always have to have, you have to start with an invite. But sometimes rehearse just doesn't make sense, depending upon how they responded. You might go right to a suggestion, or you might find within a conversation, there's this invite, rehearse, maybe you invite again. There are some examples within the book that sort of take you through conversations with some of these coaches and teachers we worked with. And you see that it's not always boom, 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 but hopefully the teacher, if they couldn't come up with something, they've got something, some sort of a suggestion that they can go away and work with.
Right.
And generalizing, again, a lot of times coaches tell us they run out of time. But what we're hoping over time, you think about, if you're working on the same practice, the same challenge, the next time, that you make sure that you've really tried to pull out what that takeaway is that you're going to take with you to the next lesson.
I love it. That's a really important point. And it kind of echoes everything that I think in a math classroom that is true as well, where, we can't be robotic in, the implementation of a structure, right? It's like, it's there to guide, it's there to bring you back on track. Like we've all been in that moment where you're speaking in front of a room, whether it's children, teenagers, or adults. And then you sort of go, where am I again? Like I thought I was all prepared, but now here I am. And how do I get back on? Oh, okay. I'm back to the structure, but that doesn't make sense based on what I know. Let's move on to the next. So there's a bit of that, formative assessment happening during that conversation that is so key and critical. Peg, there's been so much knowledge that you've shared in this short conversation. I'm knowing based on being able to read the draft of the book, and I know there's so many more goodies inside there for educators. I'm wondering here, for those who are listening, if they could only take away one big idea from this concept and maybe this book in general, what would you say is the big takeaway that you'd like them to walk away with?
I think that maybe the most important thing is to think about, Yvonne, you've made a lot of connections between what teachers do with students and what the coaches are doing with teachers. And I think that, if you think about what we're trying to do instructionally with children is we're trying to give them something challenging to work on, and then letting them work on it and work through it and find ways to support them. And that's really exactly what this model is doing for teachers. And the inquiry, like inquiring, inviting, what is it? How are you thinking about this? So really trying to make sure the teacher's ideas are what's driving the conversation in much the same way that you want students' ideas to be driving the conversation about the task at hand. And because in this case of teaching and coaching, the teacher has identified what's challenging for them. So now let them try to struggle through that challenge so that they have the opportunity to experience productive struggle in the same way we want students to. And so I'd like to think that the tools and the models that we've provided in the book are all meant to help you do that.
I can already confidently say that being introduced to the 5 practices made me a far more intentional educator. I felt more comfortable in the space. I felt more prepared, and I can certainly see myself adopting this structure in a coaching role and having that same benefit. So I'm thrilled to read the book when it comes out in November. I'm already going to be sharing it with colleagues, letting them know it's on the way. But before we leave you today, is there anywhere of course, we're really familiar with your work. Your work has inspired us, but we may have some listeners who are just learning about 5 practices through this episode. Is there a way that they can find you, find your work, and really, where will they be able to get their hands on coaching the 5 practices, and when do you anticipate the release?
Okay. Well, this book is it's in the hands of the printer as we speak, and it's going to be published by the end of this month. And I looked on Amazon today, you can pre-order, and they say it's shipping on September 10th, which seems very quick to me. But also, if folks want to order the book through Corwin, I can give them a code and they can get a 25% discount.
Awesome. Well, if you'd like to share the code with us, feel free to say it and or send it to us and we can put it in the show notes, and we'll do both.
Okay.
So that yeah, we love our friends at Corwin. They've done a lot of sponsorships for our virtual summit. And although we can always cut this out if you say no, we were intending to invite you to present at the summit this November and potentially share some of the work that you've done in this book, if that's of interest. I know you'll need to check your calendars and all of those things, but we know that in the past, your sessions have been a huge hit for the Making Math Moments That Matter community, and we'd love to have you back if that's of interest to you.
Send me the date, and if it works, I will definitely do it. Right now, November's open, but I am planning a trip, so give me that date and I'll try to plan around it.
There you go.
And I will send you the code, but it's very easy. I mean, you just go to corwin.com and it's Raven, RAVEN 25.
Excellent. That is fantastic. Peg, it is always a pleasure. John was very disappointed that he was unable to join us here today, but as a positive, we got to hang out with Yvette, and I think she was very excited that she was able to join us here because
Yeah.
I know she loves your work just as much as we do. So thanks again, Peg. We hope that you have an awesome, awesome rest of the day, and we're hopeful that the date in November will work for you. So please stay in touch and keep on doing the great work.
And thank you. This is really fun. And send my regards to John.
I definitely will. Take care.
Okay, bye.